Some storms don't come to destroy anything, they come to reveal what was never meant to stay hidden. The wind that morning howled like it had something to prove, tearing across the empty streets of Blackridge, Montana, carrying needles of ice that stung like memory against exposed skin, and most people had already sealed themselves inside, curtains drawn, heaters humming, waiting for the blizzard to pass like all the others. But not everything in that town had found shelter, and not everything wanted to be found, because out there, where the road blurred into white nothingness, a lone German shepherd moved against the storm, her body low, her breath visible in sharp bursts, her belly heavy with life she was trying to protect, each step slower than the last, yet stubbornly forward as if she wasn't just running from something, but towards something no one else could see, and she didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't cry for help, she simply kept moving, until she reached the edge of the main road and stopped, standing there in the middle of the blowing snow like a question waiting to be answered, and for a long moment, no one came, cars had long since disappeared, and even the town's usual sounds had been swallowed whole by the storm. But then, through the white haze, a figure emerged, tall, steady, walking against the wind instead of away from it. Ethan Cole had lived through worse than a Montana winter, but the cold still found its way into the spaces war had left behind, settling in his bones, in the quiet places he never spoke about, his boots pressed deep into the snow. With each step, the scrape of rubber against ice the only rhythm in a world gone silent, he wore no uniform anymore, no insignia, nothing that told the world he had once been Navy SEAL, but something in the way he moved still carried it, a kind of quiet readiness, a habit of noticing what others ignored, and that's why he saw her, not as just another stray trying to survive, but as something deliberate, something waiting. The dog didn't flinch when he got closer, didn't back away like most would. Instead, she held his gaze, her amber eyes steady despite the storm clawing at her fur, and for a second, it felt less like he had found her, and more like she had been waiting for him specifically. He crouched slightly, the wind tugging at his jacket, his breath slow, controlled, the way it had been trained to be years ago in places far more dangerous than this. "Hey there," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the howl around them, but the dog didn't move toward him, didn't seek comfort. Instead, she turned, just slightly, glancing back over her shoulder into the white distance behind her, then looked back at him again, and in that small, quiet gesture, something shifted, because that wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it was intention, and Ethan felt it before he understood it. The same instinct that once told him when something wasn't right, when a situation didn't add up, when danger wasn't where it was supposed to be. And then, without a sound, the dog began to walk again, not away in panic, but forward with purpose, stopping after a few steps to make sure he was still there, still watching, still choosing, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Ethan didn't call out, didn't try to stop her, didn't turn back toward the safety of his truck parked a quarter mile behind him. Instead, he exhaled slowly, adjusted his gloves, and followed, because somewhere beneath the roar of the storm, beneath the weight of everything he had tried to leave behind, a quiet thought surfaced, steady and undeniable. That dog isn't running, she's leading, and maybe, just maybe, she had been searching for someone willing to listen. The snow swallowed their tracks almost as soon as they were made, each step erased by the restless wind, yet the dog never hesitated, her path cutting through the drifting white like a memory she refused to lose, and Ethan followed close behind, his eyes narrowed against the sting of ice, his breath steady even as the cold pressed harder against his chest, because something about the way she moved kept him from turning back. It was not desperation, not the frantic zigzag of an animal trying to survive, it was measured, deliberate, as if every step had already been decided long before the storm arrived, and that unsettled him more than the silence, more than the way the town had disappeared behind them without a trace, because he had seen that kind of certainty before, in places where hesitation cost lives, where instinct was the only thing that remained when everything else fell apart, and now it lived inside this animal, guiding her through a world that had been reduced to white and wind. After nearly half a mile, the road beneath them faded completely, replaced by uneven ground hidden under layers of snow, the land sloping downward into a stretch of forgotten terrain where no houses stood, no lights flickered, only the faint outline of trees bent under the weight of ice, their branches creaking like old bones shifting in their sleep. The dog slowed then, her breathing heavier, her body trembling for a moment before she pushed forward again, and Ethan noticed the strain in her movement, the careful way she placed each paw, protecting not just herself but the life she carried, and something tightened in his chest. Not pity, not exactly, but recognition, because he knew what it meant to carry something fragile through conditions that did not care whether you made it or not. The wind shifted suddenly, changing direction with a low, hollow sound that echoed across the open land, and for a brief second, Ethan thought he heard something else beneath it, a faint rhythm, distant and uneven, like a knock muffled by layers of earth and snow. He stopped, his head tilting slightly, listening the way he had been trained to listen years ago, separating noise from meaning, chaos from pattern. But the storm surged again, swallowing the sound before he could be certain. Ahead of him, the dog had stopped once more, her ears pricked forward, her body rigid, not in fear, but in focus. She turned back to him again, those amber eyes searching his face as if asking a question she could not voice, and Ethan felt the answer settle into him without words. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly beneath the shifting ice, and that was when he saw it, not clearly, not at first, just a subtle break in the landscape, a shape that did not belong to the natural lines of snow and stone, half buried beneath drifts, the faint outline of a structure pressed low into the earth as if it had been forgotten on purpose. The dog moved toward it without hesitation, her pace quickening despite her exhaustion, and when she reached the edge of what looked like a collapsed roofline, she began to dig, her paws pushing through layers of packed snow with sudden urgency, the calm determination gone, replaced by something deeper, something that trembled with need. Ethan closed the distance quickly now, dropping to one knee beside her, his gloved hands brushing away the snow she had loosened, revealing weathered wood beneath, cracked and pale with age. And then he heard it again, clearer this time, a faint sound from below, not loud, not strong, but steady enough to exist, a reminder that something under them was still holding on. Ethan pressed his palm against the exposed surface, feeling for vibration, for any sign of movement, and for a moment everything else fell away, the storm, the cold, the years between. Who he had been and who he had become, all of it narrowed into a single, quiet truth, that whatever lay beneath that frozen ground had been waiting, not for rescue, but for someone willing to follow a path no one else could see. And he realized then, with a certainty that settled deeper than thought, the dog had not escaped the storm, she had walked straight into it, because sometimes the only way to find what matters is to move toward what everyone else is running from. The wood groaned softly beneath Ethan's weight as he cleared more of the snow, each movement careful, deliberate, the way he had learned to approach anything unknown, because rushing had a cost he understood too well. And beside him, the dog worked with a quiet urgency that bordered on desperation, her paws digging until the brittle surface gave way to a narrow seam, just wide enough for cold air to slip through from below, carrying with it a faint, stale scent that did not belong to the storm. Ethan paused, his breath steadying as he leaned closer, listening again, and there it was, clearer now, a soft, uneven tapping that rose from somewhere beneath the buried structure, not strong enough to be called a signal, but too intentional to be dismissed as shifting wood or settling ice. And something in his chest tightened, not fear, but recognition, because he had heard that kind of sound before, not in snow, but in collapsed buildings, in places where time ran thin and hope became quiet. He brushed away the last layer of snow and exposed what looked like a small hatch, its edges worn smooth by years, almost invisible against the rest of the structure, as if it had never been meant to be found easily. The dog stepped back for a moment, her body trembling, her sides rising and falling faster now, and for the first time since he had seen her, she let out a low, strained sound, not a bark, not quite a whine, but something deeper, something that carried both urgency and trust. Ethan placed a gloved hand gently along her neck, grounding her, grounding himself. "I hear it too," he said quietly, though the wind tried to take the words before they settled. Then he shifted his focus back to the hatch. Running his fingers along the edge until he found a narrow gap, he pulled at it carefully, testing the resistance, and at first, it did not move, frozen in place by time and ice, but he adjusted his grip, bracing his boots against the uneven ground, and applied steady pressure instead of force, and slowly, with a low, reluctant creak, the hatch gave just enough to break the seal, a thin line opening between the wood and the frame, releasing a breath of air from below that felt warmer than it should have, as if whatever lay beneath still held onto a trace of life. Ethan widened the opening inch by inch, until the space was enough for him to see darkness below, not empty, but layered, as though the structure extended deeper than the surface suggested. And then the sound came again, closer now, a faint movement followed by a soft exhale that did not belong to the wind. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering instinctively. "Hello?" The word drifted down into the narrow space, and for a moment there was nothing, just the distant howl above them and the quiet tension of waiting. Then, from somewhere below, came a response, not clear, not strong, but unmistakably human. A fragile sound shaped by exhaustion rather than fear, and Ethan felt something shift inside him, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time, the weight of being needed, the kind that did not come with orders or expectations, only with the simple truth that someone was still holding on. He moved quickly now, but not carelessly, widening the opening further, clearing away broken wood and packed snow until the hatch could lift fully, revealing a narrow set of steps descending into shadow. The dog moved closer again, her head lowering as she looked into the opening, her ears tilted forward, her body still trembling but no longer uncertain, as if she knew they had reached the place she had been searching for all along. Ethan took a slow breath, the cold air filling his lungs, steadying him, and for a brief moment, the storm above seemed distant, almost irrelevant, because everything that mattered had shifted below their feet, and as he prepared to descend into the dim, confined space, one quiet realization settled deeper than anything else, that sometimes the smallest signs, the faintest sounds, are not accidents at all, but invitations, waiting for someone willing to listen long enough to hear them. The steps creaked softly under Ethan's weight as he lowered himself into the narrow passage, one hand braced against the rough wall, the other holding the edge of the hatch above just long enough to guide himself down without slipping. The air below felt different, not warm exactly, but sheltered, carrying a stillness that the storm could not reach, and behind him, the dog remained at the opening, her silhouette framed by the pale light above, watching him with a quiet intensity as if making sure he did not go alone into whatever waited beneath. The darkness adjusted slowly, shapes forming out of shadow, a small confined space no more than 8 feet across, its ceiling low enough that Ethan had to tilt his head slightly. The walls reinforced with aged timber, worn but holding, and in the far corner, barely visible at first, was the source of the sound, a figure wrapped in layers of fabric, sitting against the wall with knees drawn in, still, too still until a faint movement broke through, a slight shift of the shoulders, a shallow breath that proved life had not yet let go. Ethan moved forward carefully, each step measured, his presence announced not by sudden motion but by the quiet steadiness of someone who understood that fear could grow in silence. "It is all right," he said, his voice low and even, the kind of tone that did not demand trust but offered it. The figure stirred again, slowly lifting their head, revealing the outline of a woman, her face pale in the dim light, her eyes searching through exhaustion rather than panic, as if she had already spent whatever fear she had left and was holding on to something quieter, something more fragile. Hope stretched thin but not broken. Ethan crouched down a few feet away, not too close, giving her space to see him clearly, to understand that he was not part of whatever had brought her here. "You are not alone," he added, the words simple but grounded, and for a moment, the only response was the faint sound of her breathing, uneven but steady enough to matter. Above them, a soft scrape broke through the stillness as the dog shifted at the opening, then carefully, slowly, she began to descend as well, her movements cautious, each step deliberate despite the strain in her body, and when she reached the floor, she did not hesitate. She walked directly toward the woman and stopped just short, lowering her head slightly, her ears relaxed now, her posture no longer tense, and something in that quiet gesture changed the space. The woman's eyes softened, her hand lifting weakly as if guided by instinct more than strength, resting gently against the dog's neck, and for the first time since Ethan had entered, a small, fragile exhale escaped her, not quite relief, but something close to it, something that acknowledged she had been found. Ethan watched the exchange without interrupting, recognizing the unspoken connection that had led them here, because whatever this animal had sensed, whatever had drawn her through the storm, it had not been random, it had been precise, intentional, as if she had followed a thread no human could see. He shifted slightly, scanning the space more carefully now, noticing details that had not been obvious at first: a small lantern, unlit but recently used, a metal container half covered in frost, a narrow table pushed against the wall with objects arranged too deliberately to be abandoned, and beneath it all, a feeling that this place had not simply been lost to time, but set aside, hidden in a way that suggested purpose rather than accident. Ethan's gaze returned to the woman, his voice steady once more. "Can you stand?" he asked gently, already preparing for the answer before it came, knowing that whatever strength she had left would not last long in the cold above. And as he reached out, careful not to startle her, another quiet realization settled into him, deeper than the storm, deeper than the years he had spent trying to walk away from moments like this, that sometimes, being led somewhere is not about finding answers right away, but about arriving exactly where you're needed, at the only time that still matters. The woman's hand trembled slightly as she tried to push herself upright, her strength uneven, like something that had been stretched too far for too long. And Ethan moved closer without rushing, one hand steady beneath her arm, the other bracing against the wall to support both their weight. "Take your time," he said quietly, his voice carrying a calm that did not force movement but allowed it, and she nodded faintly, her breath shallow but determined, rising inch by inch until she was no longer pressed against the cold boards, her balance unsteady but present, and for a moment she closed her eyes, as if simply standing required more than her body wanted to give. The dog remained beside her, unmoving, her presence anchored, as if she understood that stillness was what mattered most now. Ethan adjusted his stance slightly, guiding the woman toward the narrow steps, already calculating the safest way to get her above ground without pushing her beyond what she could manage. The hatch above shifted faintly as the wind pressed against it, reminding him that the storm had not eased, only paused enough to let them work. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his tone steady but not urgent, because urgency could break what little strength she had left. The woman opened her eyes again, looking at him more clearly now, and there was something in her gaze that lingered longer than expected, not confusion, not fear, but recognition of a different kind. As if she understood that being found was not the end of something, but the beginning of what came next. She nodded once, slow and deliberate, and together they moved toward the steps, each movement careful, measured, Ethan supporting most of her weight as they climbed, the narrow space forcing them into close balance, the wood creaking softly beneath them, until at last they reached the opening, the cold air rushing in sharper now, biting against exposed skin, but carrying with it the undeniable clarity of outside. The dog climbed up first, pulling herself onto the snow with effort, then turning immediately, her body low, watching as Ethan lifted the woman up through the hatch, guiding her carefully onto the surface. The storm greeted them again, not as violently as before, but still relentless, wind sweeping across the open ground in long, low waves, and for a moment, all three of them stood there, the world stretching wide in every direction, silent except for the breath they shared. Ethan adjusted his grip, wrapping one arm more securely around the woman's shoulders, already planning the route back, measuring distance against her condition, knowing they could not move fast, but they had to move steadily. And just as he turned slightly to orient himself, the dog did something that made him pause. She did not step forward toward the direction they had come from, did not lead them back the way she had brought him. Instead, she remained still, her ears tilting, her gaze shifting back toward the structure they had just uncovered, her body tense again, not with exhaustion, but with focus. And then, slowly, she stepped away from them, circling back toward the hatch, her movements quieter now, more deliberate than before. Ethan watched her for a moment, something tightening in his chest, because that was not the behavior of an animal ready to leave, it was the behavior of one that had not finished what it came to do. "Hey," he called softly, not a command, just a question, but the dog did not respond immediately. She reached the edge of the opening again, lowering her head slightly as if listening for something deeper, something beyond what they had already found. And in that quiet hesitation, Ethan felt the situation shift once more, because whatever had brought her here had not ended with the rescue, it had only revealed the first layer, and as the wind moved around them, carrying the sound of distant nothingness across the frozen land, one quiet thought settled into him with unmistakable clarity, that sometimes the hardest part of being led somewhere is realizing that the path does not end when you expect it to. It only asks whether you are willing to keep following. The wind pressed harder against them as if reminding them that time did not wait for decisions, but Ethan did not move, not yet, his eyes fixed on the dog as she stood at the edge of the open hatch, her head lowered, Her ears angled forward with that same quiet intensity he had seen before, and it was there again, that feeling he could not ignore, the sense that this moment was not finished, that leaving now would mean walking away from something still unresolved. The woman beside him shifted slightly, her weight leaning more heavily into his arm, and he felt the urgency of her condition, the need to get her somewhere warm, somewhere safe. But even as he turned his attention back to her, the dog let out a soft, low sound, not loud enough to cut through the storm, but clear enough to reach him, and it was not a call for help, it was a signal, the same kind of signal that had led him here in the first place. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath fogging in the cold air as he made a decision that did not come from logic alone. "We are not done yet," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Then he guided the woman carefully to a spot just a few feet from the hatch where the wind was slightly less direct. Lowering her gently onto a patch of packed snow near the broken structure, he shrugged off his outer jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders without hesitation, sealing what warmth he could around her. "Stay with me," he said quietly, meeting her eyes long enough to anchor the words, and she nodded faintly, her fingers clutching the fabric as if holding on to more than just heat. Ethan turned back toward the hatch, his movements deliberate but faster now, drawn by the same quiet pull that had not steered him wrong so far. The dog had already begun descending again, her body slipping carefully into the opening despite the strain in her frame, and when Ethan followed, the space below felt different. This time, not because it had changed, but because his awareness had sharpened, every detail standing out more clearly, the placement of objects, the angle of the walls, the faint traces of movement that suggested this place had not been abandoned as long as it appeared. The dog moved toward the far side of the room, past where the woman had been sitting, her nose close to the ground, tracing something invisible, and then she stopped, her paw pressing lightly against a section of the floor that looked no different from the rest. Ethan crouched beside her, brushing his hand across the surface, feeling for any irregularity, and there it was, subtle but real, a slight give beneath the wood, as if something lay hidden just below. He shifted his weight and pressed more firmly, and the board responded with a faint hollow sound, different from the solid structure around it. Ethan glanced briefly toward the steps above, then back to the dog, and without hesitation, he began clearing the area. Moving aside a small crate and a folded piece of fabric that had been placed over the section as if to conceal it without drawing attention, the dog stepped back, watching closely, her body tense again, her breathing shallow but focused, and as Ethan pried at the edge of the board, it lifted more easily than expected, revealing a narrow compartment beneath, not deep, but deliberate. Inside were objects arranged with care, a small device with a cracked screen, a stack of papers sealed in a weathered folder, and a metal tag stamped with numbers that meant nothing at first glance, but carried a weight he recognized instantly, not because of what they said, but because of how they were placed. Organized, preserved. This was not random, this was evidence, the kind that someone hides when it matters too much to lose. Ethan reached in slowly, lifting the folder with steady hands, and even before he opened it, he understood that whatever story had brought the woman here, whatever had driven the dog through the storm, it was larger than survival, larger than a single moment of rescue, and as the faint light from above filtered down into the hidden space, catching the edges of what had been buried beneath the surface, one quiet truth settled into him with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that sometimes the things we are led to find are not just meant to be seen, they are meant to be revealed, no matter how deeply they were meant to stay hidden. The moment Ethan lifted the folder into the dim light, the air in the small space seemed to shift, not physically, but in a way that made everything feel more deliberate, more connected, as if the pieces of something unseen were quietly falling into place. He opened it carefully, mindful of the brittle edges, and inside were pages filled with names, dates, coordinates, all arranged in a pattern that was too precise to be accidental. His eyes moved across the information slowly, not rushing, letting recognition build instead of forcing it, because he had seen structures like this before, systems hidden beneath ordinary places, designed to go unnoticed until someone looked closely enough, and beside him, the dog remained still, her gaze fixed not on the papers, but on Ethan, as if she understood that what mattered now was not what had been found, but what would be done with it. He reached for the small device next, turning it over in his hand, its surface scratched but intact, and when he pressed the side, the screen flickered faintly, struggling against the cold, a weak glow illuminating fragments of stored data, short recordings, location markers, timestamps that lined up too closely with the notes in the folder to be coincidence. And Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest, the kind that did not need explanation. This place had been used, not abandoned, hidden in plain sight beneath a storm that erased tracks and silenced questions, and whatever had happened here had been meant to stay buried. He closed the folder slowly, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if acknowledging the weight of what he now carried. Then he stood, the low ceiling forcing him to straighten carefully, and for a brief second, he closed his eyes, not in hesitation, but in clarity, because the path forward had already begun to form, and when he opened them again, his focus was sharper, more defined. He turned toward the steps, the dog rising beside him without needing direction, her body still strained but steady, and together they moved back toward the surface, the cold air rushing in stronger now as he pushed the hatch open. The storm still present but no longer overwhelming, as if it had already done what it came to do. The woman looked up as they emerged, her eyes searching his face not for answers, but for truth, and Ethan met her gaze without speaking at first, because some things did not need words. He knelt beside her, adjusting the jacket around her shoulders, his voice calm, grounded. "You are safe now," he said, but there was something in the way he said it that carried more than reassurance. It carried a promise, not just of warmth or shelter, but of something being brought into the light. The dog stepped closer then, lowering herself carefully beside the woman, her body finally easing slightly as if the tension she had carried through the storm was beginning to release, but her eyes remained alert, watchful, not of danger, but of what came next. Ethan glanced once more at the structure behind them, the snow already beginning to soften its edges again, trying to reclaim it, to hide it once more beneath layers of quiet. But this time, it would not be enough, because what had been uncovered was no longer just a place, it was a story, one that had waited long enough to be told. And as Ethan helped the woman to her feet again, turning them toward the direction of the distant town, the wind shifting gently at their backs instead of against them, one final realization settled into him, steady and unshakable, that sometimes the truth does not need force to emerge, it only needs someone willing to follow where it leads, no matter how far into the storm it begins. The journey back was slower than the path that had led them into the storm, each step measured not by distance but by endurance, Ethan adjusting his pace to match the woman's strength, his arms steady around her as the wind moved in long, quiet currents across the open land, no longer harsh, but persistent enough to remind them they were still inside something larger than themselves. The town remained out of sight, hidden beyond the white horizon, yet Ethan did not rush, because rushing now would break the fragile balance they had managed to hold, and beside them, the dog moved differently than before, no longer pulling ahead with urgency, but staying close, her body lowered slightly as if conserving what little energy remained, her breathing slower now, but uneven in a way that spoke of more than exhaustion. Ethan noticed it without looking directly, the subtle shift in her stride, the careful way she placed her paws, and something in his chest tightened again, not with fear, but with understanding, because life did not wait for perfect conditions, and neither did moments like this. After what felt like longer than it should have, the faint outline of the town began to take shape through the thinning snow, rooftops emerging like quiet promises against the pale sky, and as they reached the first stretch of cleared road, Ethan guided the woman toward his truck, its engine long cold, its surface dusted in a thin layer of ice. He opened the passenger door and helped her inside carefully, adjusting the seat so she could rest without strain. Then he moved quickly around to the driver's side, starting the engine with a steady turn, the low hum filling the silence in a way that felt grounding, real. The heater began to push out warm air slowly, not enough to erase the cold, but enough to begin pushing it back. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing evening out slightly as the warmth reached her, and when she opened them again, she looked at Ethan with a quiet clarity that had not been there before. "They were using that place," she said softly, her voice still weak, but steady enough to carry meaning. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then back at the road ahead, giving her space to speak at her own pace. "I found something I was not supposed to find," she continued, her gaze distant for a moment as if tracing memory rather than words. "They thought the storm would erase everything, that no one would come looking, but I hid what I could." Her hand shifted slightly, resting near the edge of the seat as if holding on to the thought itself. Ethan nodded once, not interrupting, because what she was saying aligned too closely with what he had already seen, the folder now resting securely beside him, the device still faintly lit on the dashboard, silent but present. The dog climbed into the back of the truck with careful effort, her movements slower now, and once inside, she settled down without hesitation, her body curling slightly, her head lowering as if the moment she had been carrying had finally reached its end. Ethan glanced at her through the rearview mirror, noticing the subtle tremor that passed through her frame, and he understood without needing to be told, she had not just led him to something, she had held on to it long enough for him to find it, and now, whatever came next would no longer depend on her alone. The truck began to move, tires crunching over the thin layer of ice as they made their way toward the center of town, where lights were beginning to return, small signs of life breaking through the aftermath of the storm. And as the road stretched ahead of them, clearer with each passing yard, one quiet realization settled over Ethan with a calm certainty, that some truths are not uncovered by chance, they are carried, protected, and delivered at exactly the moment when someone is finally ready to see them for what they are. By the time they reached the center of town, the storm had begun to loosen its grip, not fully gone, but softened, like a voice that had already said what it needed to say. The streets were still quiet, though a few lights had returned in scattered windows, small signs that life was slowly stepping back into place. Ethan pulled the truck to a stop near the only clinic that stayed open through winter storms, its front porch light glowing steady against the pale morning. He stepped out quickly, the cold air meeting him again, but it no longer carried the same weight, because now there was direction, purpose. He opened the passenger door and helped the woman down with careful hands, guiding her inside where warmth wrapped around them in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after the hours in the cold. A nurse looked up, surprise flickering across her face before she moved forward without hesitation, taking over gently, leading the woman further inside, and for a brief moment, as their hands parted, the woman looked back at Ethan, her expression no longer fragile, but steady, grounded by something deeper than relief. "You were meant to find that place," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that did not need explanation. Ethan did not answer right away, he only gave a small nod, because part of him understood, even if he had not been looking for it. Once she was out of sight, he stepped back outside, the door closing behind him with a soft click, and the world felt different now, the air clearer, the silence no longer heavy but open. He walked back to the truck, opening the back door slowly. The dog still curled where she had settled, her breathing steady but slower now, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion she had carried through the storm. Ethan crouched beside her, his hand resting gently along her side, and he felt it then, the subtle shift beneath his palm, the quiet rhythm of new life preparing to arrive, not urgent, not strained, just present, unfolding in its own time. And he stayed there for a moment, not moving, not speaking, simply allowing the stillness to settle, because after everything that had led them here, this felt like the part that mattered most, not the discovery, not the truth hidden beneath the snow, but this, the continuation of something fragile and real. He adjusted a blanket from the front seat and laid it gently over her, creating a small pocket of warmth, and as he did, the dog opened her eyes briefly, looking at him not with urgency anymore, but with a quiet recognition, as if she understood that the weight she had carried was no longer hers alone. Ethan closed the truck door softly and moved around to the driver's side, the folder and the device still resting where he had placed them, silent but undeniable. He picked them up for a moment, feeling their weight in his hands, then set them back down carefully, because he knew what they meant, and he knew what needed to be done. But for now, there was no rush, because truth, once found, did not disappear again so easily. He leaned back in the seat, the engine idling quietly, and looked out across the town as it slowly came back to life, people stepping outside, clearing paths, checking on one another, small acts of care that went unnoticed most days but mattered more than anyone said. And in that quiet return to normal, Ethan felt something shift inside him, something that had been still for a long time, not broken, not lost,